It was a cold evening in Los Angeles, and the streets of Hollywood were buzzing with activity as usual. The stars, directors, and producers all ran their daily errands, each lost in their own world, chasing the next big thing, the next story. It was a city where fame could be made or shattered in the blink of an eye. But no one ever imagined it would happen to Clint Eastwood. Dear listeners, please subscribe my channel to hit 1,000 numbers. For decades, Clint had been a pillar of Hollywood. He was the rugged, no-nonsense cowboy, the stoic gunslinger who defined westerns with his infamous characters. From Dirty Harry to Unforgiven, Clint had not only built an empire of films, but had become synonymous with strength, justice, and grit. His name alone carried weight, and when Clint Eastwood spoke, people listened. But now, things were changing. The first signs were subtle. At an industry gala, whispers began to circulate. Some of the younger filmmakers, fresh to the scene, started to make quiet remarks about Clint's age. "He's just too old for these roles anymore," one said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. Another shrugged it off, saying, "He's a relic of a time that's long gone. Hollywood's looking for something new." Clint overheard bits and pieces of these conversations, but he remained unfazed. After all, he'd been through this before. New generations came and went, but Clint Eastwood's legacy had stood the test of time. It wasn't just the big stars that spoke of him with reverence. The audiences had adored him for years. He still filled theaters. But soon, the whispers started becoming louder. Major production houses were no longer knocking on his door with the same urgency. Clint's longtime collaborators, the directors and producers he had trusted over the years, were growing distant. There was talk of younger talent being groomed to take on the roles Clint once owned. Times were changing, they said. It wasn't just Hollywood that was turning on him. It was also the press. Articles began to surface, with clickbait headlines like, "Is Clint Eastwood's time up?" and "Has Hollywood moved past Clint Eastwood?" Even critics who once hailed his work as legendary started to churn out negative reviews of his latest films. The public wasn't as forgiving as they had been before. Clint didn't understand. How could this be happening? He dedicated his life to cinema, never once compromising on his principles or art. He had given the industry everything, and in return, this was how they repaid him. The first major blow came when Clint was denied a prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award at a film festival. Instead, a younger actor, someone with only a fraction of Clint's experience, received the honor. The snub felt deliberate. Hollywood, it seemed, had moved on. It was the moment Clint realized that the industry he had once shaped had now turned its back on him. Clint Eastwood had always been a man of action, not words. Throughout his career, his presence had spoken louder than any interview or press release ever could. But now, as the industry began to turn its back on him, Clint found himself in a rare position, one where the public opinion mattered more than ever. The media's treatment of Clint took a sharp turn. Once, they celebrated his unwavering tough guy image, his relentless pursuit of justice, and the way he portrayed characters who lived by their own moral codes. He was the man who made audiences stand up and cheer, the one who took on villains with a calm intensity and walked away as the hero. But now, the headlines painted him as a faded star, out of touch with the times. Has Clint Eastwood lost his edge? Was the question echoing through the entertainment world. Public perception shifted too. A lot of his longtime fans were in disbelief, unable to comprehend how Hollywood could turn on Clint so suddenly. They spoke out on social media, flooding platforms with posts about the actor's undeniable contribution to cinema, urging others to support him. On Twitter, hashtags like #Save Clint and Bring Back Eastwood started trending. Fans shared their favorite Clint moments, the "Go ahead, make my day" line from Dirty Harry, the brutal realism of Unforgiven, the unwavering grit of Gran Torino. It was a wave of nostalgia, a collective effort to remind Hollywood that Clint Eastwood had earned his place as an icon. He wasn't just an actor or director. He was a piece of cinematic history. But as much as fans rallied behind him, the sentiment in Hollywood was different. Executives, who once clamored to work with him, now saw him as a relic. Clint was still invited to award shows, but the respect he had earned through decades of hard work had eroded. He was now treated like a guest at his own table, politely applauded but never fully embraced. One morning, Clint opened his inbox to find an email from an old colleague. It was short and to the point. "I'm sorry, Clint. The studio has decided to go in a different direction for this role. They're looking for someone younger, with more appeal to the modern audience." Clint chuckled darkly. He'd seen this coming. His name had once been the key to making movies, but now it seemed that the key had been replaced by something new, something marketable. The emails, the calls, the offers, all of them had started to dry up. The industry he'd spent his life conquering no longer wanted him. He wasn't the box office draw he used to be. The audience had moved on. Yet, despite all of this, Clint knew one thing for certain. Hollywood could turn its back on him all it wanted. But the fans, the people who had supported him from the beginning, still believed in him. And that, he realized, was the one thing he had never needed to prove. But even as he walked through the streets of Los Angeles, Clint couldn't help but feel a pang of betrayal. The very people he had trusted, who had once called him a legend, were now turning their backs. The public might be loyal, but loyalty alone couldn't turn back time. And in Hollywood, time waited for no one. As the weeks passed, Clint Eastwood's isolation from Hollywood grew more apparent. The whispers about his career grew louder. The calls stopped coming, and the few invitations he did receive felt more like formalities than genuine opportunities. The industry was moving on without him, or so it seemed. Clint knew that his place in the business was slipping away, but he wasn't the kind of man to sit back and wait for things to change on their own. In the middle of all this, Clint found himself sitting at his desk, the weight of a stack of unopened scripts in front of him. He'd been in the business long enough to know that some of these scripts had no real potential. They were just another attempt to cash in on a fading star. Some of them even felt insulting. A man of Clint's stature wasn't supposed to be playing roles designed for younger actors or be relegated to the background. One afternoon, Clint received a call that nearly knocked the wind out of him. It was from an old friend, a filmmaker who had worked with him years ago on one of his most successful projects. The filmmaker's voice crackled through the phone, sounding hesitant and uncertain. "Clint, I'm sorry to call under these circumstances, but I'm in a bit of a tight spot," the friend said. "I've got a project in the works, but the studio wants someone younger, someone more relevant. They don't think people are ready for you anymore, man. I just thought you should know." Clint felt a sting. He hadn't expected sympathy, but hearing it out loud, knowing that even his friends were starting to believe Hollywood's narrative, hit harder than he anticipated. "Don't worry about it," Clint replied, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of years of frustration. "If Hollywood thinks they can make it without me, let them try." Clint hung up the phone and sat in silence for a while, staring at the empty desk before him. He could feel the walls closing in, the reality of being cast aside by an industry that had once adored him. But there was something deep inside him, something that refused to let him simply fade into obscurity. It was at that moment that Clint made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for the phone to ring. He wasn't going to beg for his place back at the table. He was going to create his own path. He'd always been known for defying expectations, for doing things his own way. And if Hollywood wanted to write him off, he was going to show them why that was a mistake. Clint dusted off a screenplay that had been sitting on his shelf for years, a project that had once been a passion project, a story close to his heart. It was gritty, raw, and deeply personal. The kind of film he knew was made for him, the kind of movie that would prove that age wasn't a limitation, but a strength. He called a few trusted producers, the ones who knew Clint was capable of more than just a paycheck role. He told them he was ready to make this film, no matter what it took. If Hollywood wouldn't give him a chance, he would find the money and the crew to do it himself. The days of waiting for validation were over. Clint's determination was palpable. It wasn't about proving Hollywood wrong anymore. It was about proving to himself that his voice still mattered, that his experience could still be put to good use. He wasn't going to go out quietly. If this was going to be his last act in the industry, he was going to make sure it counted. The phone calls Clint made that day set the wheels in motion. He was ready to create the kind of film that would remind Hollywood and the world why they had ever admired him in the first place. Clint Eastwood wasn't going to let Hollywood's rejection define his career. He was determined to prove that he still had something to offer, something that no amount of age, rumors, or industry shifts could erase. With the screenplay he'd dusted off in his hands, he went full throttle into action. He called in his trusted allies, those who had worked with him before, and they rallied around him. Some were hesitant at first, unsure if the industry had truly moved on from Clint's brand of rugged masculinity and storytelling. But as soon as they saw the passion in Clint's eyes, that fire that had always been there, they knew this wasn't just another vanity project. Clint wasn't doing this for a paycheck or validation. He was doing it because he believed in the story, a story only he could tell. The production came together faster than anyone anticipated, with Clint taking on not only the role of the star, but also the director and producer. The project took shape with a confidence that shook the foundations of Hollywood. His reputation as a director, known for his no-nonsense approach and ability to get the best performances out of his actors, ensured that this wasn't just another flop waiting to happen. This was a Clint Eastwood film, and no one could ever doubt the power he brought to the screen. As filming progressed, whispers from Hollywood started to spread. The very people who had dismissed Clint earlier were now taking notice. They saw the enthusiasm surrounding the project. They saw the buzz building, and they knew that Clint was pulling off something no one thought was possible, a true comeback. The film was gritty, unapologetic, and emotionally raw. It was the kind of movie that reminded audiences why Clint Eastwood had been one of the most iconic figures in Hollywood history. One morning, Clint arrived on set, greeted by a camera crew eager to capture the scene. The entire production had a fresh energy. Clint had always been a man of few words on set, but his actions spoke volumes. He was leading by example, showing everyone around him that age was nothing but a number, and experience was something to be valued, not discarded. He demanded excellence, but he also showed respect for the craft, for the people involved. He wasn't just a star, he was the backbone of this project, and he treated it as such. As the film neared completion, the buzz surrounding it reached a fever pitch. Hollywood, which had once turned its back on Clint Eastwood, began to whisper about the film's potential. Critics, who had once written him off as a relic of the past, began to show interest. Hollywood insiders, who had dismissed his earlier struggles as a sign of aging, were now trying to figure out how to get involved. They couldn't ignore it anymore. The film was released to critical acclaim, and Clint Eastwood had done the impossible. He had not only made a successful film on his own terms, but he had reinvigorated his career. The box office numbers reflected the audience's support. It wasn't just about nostalgia for his earlier works. It was about the raw power and relevance Clint still brought to the screen. Hollywood had underestimated him, but they couldn't ignore him anymore. The industry had turned its back on Clint Eastwood, but he had come back stronger than ever. His film was a hit, and the world saw that Clint Eastwood was far from finished. He had once again proven that he was a force to be reckoned with. A man who could outlast every trend, every industry shift, and every critic who thought he was a thing of the past. As Clint stood in front of the camera at the premiere, the weight of everything he had overcome hit him. He hadn't just fought for his place in Hollywood. He had fought for his right to tell stories that mattered. His story, the one he had written for himself, was still unfolding, and Clint knew that this was just the beginning. The premiere of Clint Eastwood's comeback film marked the beginning of a new chapter, but it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a resounding message to an industry that had almost forgotten what it meant to be truly iconic. Clint had shown that age wasn't a barrier to greatness, and that his time in the limelight was far from over. The movie became a massive hit, breaking box office records and receiving praise from critics who had once written him off. It was a testament not only to Clint's enduring talent, but to his ability to adapt and evolve. He wasn't making the same kind of films he had in the past. This was a new Clint Eastwood, one who had learned from his failures, one who had embraced change, and yet still retained that same sharp edge that had made him legendary. The critics who once dismissed him as a relic of the past were now scrambling to revise their opinions. They saw that Clint wasn't just trying to relive his glory days. He was building something new, a legacy that wasn't bound by time. Clint's comeback film earned several awards and nominations, securing his place in the contemporary Hollywood conversation once again. His performance, as expected, was nothing short of extraordinary. He didn't just play the role, he inhabited it, bringing a raw authenticity that left audiences on the edge of their seats. It wasn't the typical Clint Eastwood role of a hardened loner, but a more vulnerable, reflective character who still had the toughness of his youth but had been tempered by experience. It resonated deeply with a wide range of audiences, from loyal fans who had grown up watching his classics to younger generations discovering him for the first time. But Clint's success wasn't just about the accolades. It was about restoring his place in Hollywood and proving to himself that his career was his to define, not the studio's or critics. He became a symbol of resilience, of an artist who refused to be pigeonholed, a man who continued to evolve even in his later years. With the success of his film, Clint was back on top. Offers from major studios began flooding in again. Yet, unlike before, Clint wasn't eager to jump into every project that came his way. He had learned that quality was far more important than quantity. He handpicked his roles carefully, focusing on stories that mattered, that spoke to the human condition, and that left a lasting impact. Hollywood may have turned its back on Clint Eastwood, but his fans never did. They had always believed in him, even when the industry had forgotten. Clint's ability to connect with audiences remained unmatched. He had built a legacy that transcended film. People saw Clint not just as a movie star, but as a cultural icon, a man who stood the test of time and overcame every challenge that came his way. In interviews, Clint would reflect on this period of his career with a quiet humility. He didn't boast about his triumphs, nor did he dwell on the years when Hollywood turned on him. Instead, he would simply say, "I'm just doing what I've always done, telling stories that matter." And that was enough. Hollywood had underestimated him, but in the end, it was Clint Eastwood who had the last word. His comeback wasn't just about returning to the screen. It was about reclaiming his place as one of the most respected figures in film. As his legacy continued to grow, Clint proved that no matter how much the industry changed, some things, like real talent, grit, and heart, would never fade. Clint Eastwood had turned Hollywood's rejection into his ultimate redemption, and in doing so, he cemented his place not just in the annals of film history, but in the hearts of those who had always believed in him.